or somebody that has low blood pressure as opposed to high blood pressure, or very low heart rate. People that if they get up quickly, they get lightheaded. Those can all be signs of like a low metabolism, even if they aren't overweight, they're not gaining weight. Because on a certain level, even the ability to store fat is a metabolic process. Everything having to do with health is linked to the metabolic rate.
The Culinary Libertarian Podcast, episode 50.
Welcome to the Culinary Libertarian Podcast, where the philosophy is free, but the food is on you.
Hello, folks. Welcome back to the podcast. Dan Reed here, the Culinary Libertarian. Happy to have you here. Happy to be here. I got a few things first. Head over to my podcasts page, culinarylibertarian.com/podcasts. And from there, well, there's just all kinds of resources. You can follow me on a variety of social media links, including my Eating Liberty Facebook group. We've got Liberty folks in there and cooks and bakers. The only thing we're missing is you. From that same podcasts page, you can support the show and follow the show in a few other ways. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, make a donation and support the show with PayPal, Bitcoin, or Patreon. And at the Patreon, I've got a couple of different levels and a sticker or a mug for those different levels. Speaking of coffee mugs, you can purchase a coffee mug from my Cranky Without Coffee mug store, linked, of course, on the podcasts page, as well as sign up for my newsletter and download a copy of my free muffins e-cookbook, Foolproof Muffin Recipes, which work every time. Just give me your email address and I'll send a few emails or so a week. The last way you can show your support is by clicking over to your favorite podcatcher, such as Apple Podcasts or Stitcher, and leave a 5-star review and a positive comment. Those actions move the show up so more people can find it. Folks, for the month of September, Savory Spice has created some great deals, including a tiered savings sale. Save 15% off your order when you spend $60 or more. Savory Spice also offers free spice samples with orders placed on Monday through Thursday. Savory Spice also has a spice kit starting at $6.95, which contains themed spices and recipes for comfort meals or Mediterranean night. Click through with my affiliate link, culinarylibertarian.com/savoryspice, and check the website for details. Remember, these deals last all of September, so click through to culinarylibertarian.com/savoryspice and stock up for the fall. My guest today is Kyle Mamounis. Kyle's making his second appearance after his first visit on episode 14. Back then, we talked about sugar and fat in the diet. Today, we're going to up the ante, so to speak, and talk about metabolism, what it is, what it does, and how to help it help you, and what to do if it is low. We also talk about how to navigate the sea of misinformation online, which can have a serious result of giving the browser the exact wrong information. Kyle is a Ph.D. in nutritional science from Rutgers and has been in the nutrition and biochemistry field for a few years. Welcome back, Kyle. Thank you for joining me again on the Culinary Libertarian Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So you are making a return visit, and just as a quick reminder for people who may not have heard your first episode or have just found the show, a quick bit of your background, if you would.
My background is that, I currently work in biochemistry, but I did a PhD in nutritional science after a long journey of getting into extreme diets, whether it's like vegetarian diets, raw food diets, high carb diets, low carb diets, all kinds of diets. And then I wanted to study that formally, which I have done at least a little bit of.
So today we're going to talk, well, let me back up a little bit. When we talked last, we spoke about sugar and fat in the diet and the effects that those two things have on the body. One of the things that sort of becomes clear when you talk about body nutrition is that the body is a vastly complex system of systems, so to speak, and sugar and fat don't operate in a vacuum. So let's add one more ingredient to our mix of sugar and fat, and let's talk about metabolism. Maybe easy to ask, hard to answer. What is metabolism, and what does it do?
There's different people mean different things by that word. So some people mean, like if a person says, "Oh, my metabolism is slowing down," like they gain weight more easily or something like that. And then, somebody that works with cells, in a lab, they might call something metabolism, like the way that their cells process whatever reaction they're studying. That's like the metabolism of those molecules. So it can mean anything in between there. But as far as human health, I guess the best way to put it would be it's getting the energy from food that we eat, using oxygen, which is why we have to breathe, and turning that oxygen into carbon dioxide, and in the process getting the energy out of these food molecules for our use.
I remember years ago when I actually had some level of physical health, doing both aerobic and anaerobic exercises. Does that vernacular translate into the function of metabolism being an aerobic thing, or is there another word for it?
Yeah, a little bit. That's another case of the words meaning slightly different things in that context, in the exercise context. But our cells and all other animals and plants and some microbes, the bigger ones, like fungi, they are aerobic metabolizers. We have an aerobic metabolism. And then things like bacteria, very, very small things, they have an anaerobic metabolism. So they don't use oxygen, or at least they don't use it in the same way. They don't take things like sugar or fatty acids and turn them into CO2 the same way that we do. So in that sense, and that was a big advance in life. So the amount of energy that you can get doing it the way we do it is like an order of magnitude or a little bit more than the kind of primitive bacteria metabolism. And we can still do some of that as well, which, when you say you're exercising or you're lifting weights and your muscles start to burn and you're producing that lactic acid, you have outstripped your muscles' ability to keep up with the aerobic metabolism, and you're in an anaerobic state where you're burning sugars in the way that a bacteria does and creating lactic acid, and that's where that burning comes from. So we're kind of like, we have another system on top of that to get a lot more energy out of food molecules than bacteria do, but it's a little bit slower of a process as well.
So the people who are engaged in weightlifting and possibly distance running or any other kind of maybe endurance sport of a kind are going to end up, we hope, being informed enough about how to utilize those different stages for their own personal gain.
Yeah, well, I guess the goal would be to stay, to keep up with. It's kind of like people that live in altitude, and say if they're like a jogger and then they visit their family at sea level, and they can jog a lot easier because their ability to use oxygen has been turned up a little bit from their lower oxygen environment where they're used to. So you can kind of get like that, but there's no way that, the point of in weightlifting, you want to get into the anaerobic state because that's what signals the muscle to grow. The aerobic state would just be normal walking around use.
So metabolism is the thing that is turning the food we eat into the energy our body needs. And so the function then is it's giving us energy.
Right. Yeah. So I guess we can talk about. I'm sure you and everybody else will remember the phrase "the powerhouse of the cell," the mitochondria.
Yes.
So that's our secret weapon. The bigger cells, the more advanced than bacterial cells, we have this thing, and that's what takes the energy, the high energy molecules in food that we get, all the way, oxidizes it all the way into carbon dioxide. Not unlike the reaction of an internal combustion engine. It's just that we do it with proteins and things in our tissues rather than an engine. But it's a similar amount of energy that's released, just over a different amount of time and over different materials. Kind of like if you just blew up a bomb or blew up a car, you're going to get every penny's worth out of the gasoline in the tank, but it's not going to be very useful all getting released at once like that. So what we have though is what's called an energy currency, ATP, and pretty much everything is set up to have this. It's just a constant streaming where these molecules are modified a little bit depending on what they are. Different types of sugars, different types of fats. They get either more or less processed depending on what they are, and then they're brought into the mitochondria and sent through this constant streaming system where they're stripped of high energy electrons, and that process creates the energy to make this ATP that then is released into the cell and is then broken down itself to be replenished again, and that's what gives the energy for the cell itself to work. So it's like a streaming system. It's like a bunch of little power plants everywhere, and I guess the goal is to have that system work as efficiently as possible.
Okay, well, that makes sense. So I want to come back to this if I remember to, but I think in trying to learn about metabolism, to ask some cogent questions, I found out that I know next to nothing about metabolism. But one thing came up that it seems is important in how this very complicated system works, and that is a hormone. So is that accurate? And if it is, what is the simplest term, or how can you describe a hormone so that, well, I can understand it?
Okay. Hormones are signaling molecules. So if everything in the body is basically either energy storage or something that produces energy, that extracts energy from energy storage, or something that signals to the cells to either turn up or down energy usage, energy production, a couple other things. And hormones are they're a broad category of molecules that send out messages to other cells. So unlike a cell that would be, say, telling itself to do something, this is when one cell makes a molecule, sends it out, usually into the blood, and it will go to other cells and signal for them to do something. So under the heading hormones are the steroids. So a steroid is a type of hormone. And then there's other types. Steroids are they're made from cholesterol. They're cholesterol derivatives. So it's this whole family. That's why the name at the end, sterol, cholesterol. It's a sterol, and then a steroid is a specific type of derivative from that. And then there's hormones that are proteins.
So
Okay.
let me cut you off for 1 second. So cholesterol is a steroid, but do we produce, I don't want to get caught in the weeds of vernacular, do we create or produce other kinds of steroids? Are there more of them naturally occurring in our system?
Well, as far as our system goes, we produce all of our steroids from cholesterol, and that cholesterol can come from the diet, or it can be made in our cells from other materials. But plants have alternative sterols that are a little bit different, and that's why plant foods are cholesterol free. They don't use the same initial backbone to make their steroid type signaling molecules, but they do have molecules that are in other ways similar and just built on a different backbone, which is why a lot of people talk about plant steroids or plant sterols or phytoestrogens, things that, because estrogen is a steroid, so plants have things that can mimic our steroids in the body, and people say maybe that's not a good idea, or maybe they'll block the action of our steroids at certain concentrations.
This whole part, I'm not sure that if I ever knew it, I didn't know it quite so concisely, and that was just fascinating stuff. But that's for another show. So you mentioned a minute ago, and I want to get back to this a second. So when we, just folks, are, I'm not sure metabolism is a popular topic, but every once in a while people will say, as you said, oh, my metabolism is slowing down, or I have a naturally high metabolism. And I knew a guy who was as tall and thin as a beanpole and lived on cigarettes and peanut M&Ms and never seemed to gain an ounce. So now I know that there's what we see on the body may not reveal the truth of what's going on inside. For all I know, he could have been just tons of internal fat that I couldn't see. But as far as him still wearing a size 28 pant with a 34 inseam, the guy never changed. So there's what we see, and then there's the Karen Carpenter, what we know. So that's a different thing. But our metabolism rates, this is almost obvious on its face, our metabolism rates different person to person, and I suppose more importantly, can we and how can we alter them to our benefit?
Yes. So there's a bunch of different ways to measure that. The initial discovery of, the creation of the unit, the calorie unit, that was devised by researchers that did what's called bomb calorimetry, which is where you like the internal combustion engine, you just burn food and measure the heat that's released from it. And so a calorie is a heat unit that you get from the food. And of course, in our bodies, we don't burn things, but it's a similar sort of process. And the amount of energy that's released is comparable. Now, for the metabolic rate, there's something called indirect calorimetry, which is where you hook up somebody to a breathing apparatus that measures how much oxygen they're breathing in and how much CO2 they're breathing out. And by measuring their oxygen consumption over time, that's one of the ways that people will measure the metabolic rate. And that's usually normalized to lean mass, because fat mass has a very, very low consumption of oxygen. It doesn't have much metabolism compared to lean mass. And so over time, that basal metabolic rate can change, and certain things can cause it to, certain disease states can cause it to go up or down. And as far as your friend with so he was, would you call him skinny fat then?
Well, visually he was almost unhealthily skinny. He was it was like 6'4", and I'm not kidding. He was a pencil.
Yeah. So there's two different, as far as that's concerned, there's two main ways that our body stores fat. And the one more inert and I guess, basically healthy way is called subcutaneous fat. And so subcutaneous means under the skin. So it's between the skin and the muscle layer. And that's usually the fat in your butt is mostly subcutaneous fat. So if somebody sliced into your skin, it gets a little gruesome, but we're talking about biology here. If you were to do, an autopsy on somebody, there's some fat that as soon as you cut into the skin, you can see the fat. And then there's a second storage depot of fat called visceral fat. And to that, you have to cut through the muscle wall. So this would be a deeper storage. And that fat is more metabolically active in the sense that it's like when you're in a state where you're releasing fatty acids from your fat stores for energy, they'll come out of visceral fat sooner. Visceral fat is more accessible. So if somebody has a certain condition that causes them to store some fat, but they store more visceral than subcutaneous, they can look skinny, especially in the extremities. Like they might have a little bit of a belly, but they'll have a small butt, skinny arms and legs, not too much in the neck or the face. As opposed to, imagine the opposite being like a sumo wrestler, where they just have, that you can get those sumo wrestler fat suits and bump into each other. They just have a layer of basically blubber around their entire body. And that type of fat storage is actually more healthy than the other type, in terms of its correlation and comorbidity with things like heart disease and diabetic symptoms and all that stuff.
So visceral, the one we probably can't see, is the more, I want to avoid scary words, but the more dangerous of fats. And that's an alarming word. Dangerous. Oh my God.
It's mostly the belly fat. So if you get enough visceral fat, it's called visceral because it surrounds the viscera, which are the name for the organs. And so as it builds up enough, eventually it pushes out. And if you have a ton of visceral fat, it'll manifest as a big stomach. So you can imagine somebody with just a big pot belly, but not a lot of fat on the rest of their body. They're highly visceral, whereas the sumo wrestler body type has more subcutaneous fat stored.
Well, I'm curious about two things without getting too far into the weeds in either one of these things. The fellow, well, we assume the person with the pot belly, and say it's a rather big pot belly, I can sort of imagine that aside from the work of carrying that around every day, it seems to me that would be putting some pressure on the viscera, causing probably some problems with basic bodily functions, not just in excretion, but just in making the body happy. And then to the sumo wrestler, is that this is dangerous territory. Is that a cultural thing that the fat is subcutaneous versus visceral? And is there a way to make the body deposit fat one way and not the other?
Yeah, it's not at the level of that there's a pill or anything you can take for it, but what sumo wrestlers do is they work out a lot and then they eat a big meal, usually tons of rice and some other things, and then they go to sleep. They'll take naps after working out. And something about that regimen of eating a lot, going right to sleep, and then working out, it keeps their metabolism high, but they're overeating, so they store fat. And so they still have actually a rather healthy metabolism as compared to somebody who's gaining weight because their metabolism's slowing down, but they're still overeating. And I guess they're not using enough of those calories to build muscle or something. I don't know. It could also be some kind of genetic thing. But in terms of how people build up visceral fat, it's usually associated with things like insulin resistance. So as you start to lose the ability to signal to the body that there's enough energy, the fat cells in the visceral compartment will basically get the wrong message, and they'll take up fats in a way that is not appropriate, and other things going on, like maybe a satiety effect of having enough energy, so you'll be more hungry, and it just kind of builds up over time. There's also a gender difference. So women tend to have more fat in their butts and hips and breasts than men, we hope. And that seems to be controlled at the level of hormones. There was a popular hormone years ago, leptin, which, in the 90s it was discovered, and that was going to be the panacea of curing obesity and everything. But it ends up that it actually doesn't work, except for very, very rare cases of people that have a serious mutation in the leptin gene itself. But for people that are just normally obese or normally diabetic, they tend to be leptin resistant the same way as insulin resistance works. So giving them leptin doesn't really work. But there's a difference in the way leptin works between males and females. And, on average, and there's always differences in between individuals, but on average, a male that's gaining weight will be more resistant to gaining fat in the subcutaneous compartments. So their arms and legs and butts will gain fat slower than women. Women will tend to gain fat there faster and have a harder time losing it, but men will gain more visceral fat. So you're more likely to see a man that looks lean except has a belly, and as compared to a woman who has more, I guess, evenly distributed fat along her body. And I'm not aware of too much people can do about that. The subcutaneous fat, like baby fat, babies are obviously not,
right. Yeah.
Their metabolism is not slowing down in the way that, we think of like an older person who's gaining weight. So they have that fat for a different reason. So the hormones that are driving them to have fat, that fat storage, which I guess evolutionarily is in case there's food scarcity, you don't want babies to be rail thin if they miss a meal or two from them to starve. So they have this extra fat as like a layer of protection, a few meals in there. And, what's driving that is a totally different thing than what's driving, say a 50-year-old guy who was kind of lean his whole life. He didn't really exercise that much. And then all of a sudden he starts to put on weight, sort of living the same lifestyle because things are slowing down.
Well, I wanted to touch back on something you mentioned, and you talked about diseases.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think this is another probably whole other episode, but can our diet cause our body to think it has disease-like symptoms, and therefore that diet alters an efficient functioning of our body?
I don't think I'd word it that way. I would word it that, the diet. So let's see, the ways that diet could affect, say, something like metabolism. One really easy way. So in terms of science, the things that happen quickly, acute things, they're easier to study. So like if somebody, say cyanide poisoning, that's very well understood because it's just a really fast thing that happens, right? People know what parts of the cell are poisoned by cyanide that causes you to die. Now, something that could, say, make you prone to a heart attack in 40 years, that's a lot less clear because it takes a really long time. Obviously, it's these chronic conditions are less understood. But something that's really well understood and gets to metabolism and how important nutrition is are vitamin and mineral deficiencies. So all of the processing steps that take food molecules, high energy food molecules, and convert them into energy for us, they use enzymes. And just about all of those enzymes have a cofactor. And so a cofactor is, if you can just imagine, it's like the enzyme, because enzymes are big. So if you think of, like, say, a piece of glucose, one sugar, that will get processed by an enzyme, and that would be sort of like one person going inside of an enormous skyscraper. Those would be like the relative sizes. And then the cofactor.
In this case, the person is the glucose.
Yes. So much, much, much bigger. And the cofactor might be, say, the door in the skyscraper that lets people in and out. Now, imagine that the buildings that are doing this processing of these people, they don't come with doors. So they have like single-use doors, or it's like a post-processing. Like the building is prefab, it gets dropped in, the people are there, and then you have to have these doors. Those are like vitamins and minerals. Sometimes the vitamins and minerals bind to the enzymes that they're working with pretty tightly, so it becomes like sort of one thing. Other times they have a transitive relationship, or they might not even touch at all, but they have to be close. But basically, it's like a tool that the enzyme uses So like the B vitamins, for example, they'll complex with these enzymes to do their reaction. So if you're deficient in these vitamins, then your body is making the enzymes that it needs to do a reaction, and that becomes a bottleneck. And whatever the symptoms are, whatever the main reactions that vitamin or mineral is a cofactor for, whatever they are, that will dictate what happens to as the negative symptom of that deficiency. But pretty much all of them are involved in something that goes along with energy metabolism, because energy metabolism is pretty much the central thing of the whole works. So you could easily, just through a really severe vitamin deficiency, lower your metabolic rate such that your energy consumption goes down. This will manifest as just feeling like you have low energy, not being able to perform tasks that require stamina or anything like that. Chronic deficiencies can cause somebody to gain fat and lose muscle. And so that would be something that you get from a lack of something in the diet. But the thing about these nutrients, whether they're the big energy containing nutrients or the little ones, is you have to consume them, but they also have to make it through your system and get absorbed and put into your bloodstream and into the right cells for use. So you could be functionally deficient in a vitamin because for some other reason. So maybe you're eating a normal diet that has sufficient B vitamins, but you could still manifest a B vitamin deficiency if there's something wrong going on somewhere where your cells are not using it right, they can't bring it in right. And what makes this very difficult to study, these chronic situations. So if somebody just literally is eating a diet where the doctor can tell, oh, you're not getting any B6, and then they can prescribe, B6 supplements to the patient, and then the symptoms go away, that's fine. But when you look at something like a vitamin that's necessary for metabolism and something that maybe we'll never know what caused it to go wrong will cause the particular metabolism of that vitamin to get messed up, which will then cause other things and just a whole cascade of problems. So sometimes it's really hard to figure out exactly what's going on. It's the same thing with, the macronutrients. Like people say, oh, I changed my diet and I gained weight or I lost weight. And it's really hard to say that what they did, exactly what happened in the body. Something changed and there was some kind of result. They started eating less calories, or they started working out and then they were consuming more calories. But on a real specific level, it's almost impossible to say exactly what's going on in the context of a whole body system. Now, when people, they'll go on like a low carbohydrate diet, and then other people may go on a low fat diet, and they'll both have weight loss. Now, that's an example of different reasons for the weight loss to occur. If you hold calories very steady, usually in a clinical setting, the weight loss is the same, whether you remove fat or sugar from the diet. Now, sometimes there's differences and people argue about that a little bit, but by and large, as long as calories are kept the same, the weight loss is usually similar. But in what's called, free living populations, so where the diet isn't controlled by how much they consume, but somebody is just given a diet where they consume, say, 100 or less grams of carbohydrate per day, or 20% or less of their calories per day from fat, something like that, you notice that the different things happen that may be causing these people in the free living populations to lose weight. And a lot of people have done work showing that if you cut out a macronutrient like carbohydrate, it changes the hunger and the satiety. So you'll become if you eat a meal that's just missing carbohydrates or missing sugars, you'll be sated faster, and you won't be hungry for longer. But if you were presented with a food after you were done eating that low carbohydrate meal that had carbohydrates in it, all of a sudden you would feel hungry again. And so it's not that your body has made some sort of fundamental change, but there's some kind of signaling in the brain for hunger and satiety that gets fiddled with. And that's part of why, people can lose weight cutting out this or that.
It's funny. You mentioned the carbohydrate and satiety, and I've been paying attention for the last several months to how I feel and what I eat and how I feel after that. And we've had a couple of birthdays here, so of course we've had birthday cake because it's birthdays, and why not? But I eat a slice of cake, and all I really want is another slice of cake. And I remember reading in a book about salt that if you're feeling, boy, that sweet tooth is active, have something salty, have some salami or pepperoni or kind of a salty cheese, or even put salt on the cheese, and that it will stop the craving for the sweet thing and also return you back to that level of being satisfied. And now, accepting that not everyone's the same, but for me, that works. And I find that fairly interesting. And the salt part was interesting. And so you were talking about vitamins and actually micronutrients. So you and I have had conversations about salt, and I wrote a whole blog post about salt, and I learned that, wow, there's like the stuff in the blue box that's nice and free-flowing and never sticks and everyone uses is probably the worst thing you can have. Because while it does provide life-necessary sodium, that's probably it. And there's up to 80-some micronutrients that you can and should be getting from a salt. So we don't want necessarily to provide all of those micronutrients only from salt. Is there enough micronutrients in the salt that we would add in a normal course of cooking to help facilitate a more efficient metabolic rate, metabolic function, something?
Could be. It depends what your diet is. And in times past, when people had local diets, in a world without mass shipping, it was a lot easier. Say if you were a subsistence farmer somewhere, and the soil that you were using was deficient in something. The soil in general these days tends to be deficient in magnesium. And there's some minerals that you just need very trace amounts, like selenium or something. And you could be in a place that has a deficiency in something like that. And something like sea salt or, a salt that has a lot of minerals, that could make a huge difference.
Kyle, let me speak to the folks for a moment about fall feasts. D'Artagnan Gourmet Meat, Poultry, and Charcuterie is the website for truffles, game, wild mushrooms, beef and lamb, foie gras, and charcuterie. Whether for game time tailgating or a nice fall Sunday dinner, D'Artagnan has the proteins and garnishes you want for a great meal. Order already prepared products such as duck confit legs or truffle butter. Perhaps a whole free-range poussin with chanterelle mushrooms. Shop for a variety of gift packs or charcuterie platters for a variety of people. D'Artagnan also sells burgers and has a selection of recipe ideas if you get stuck. Use my affiliate link, culinarylibertarian.com/D'Artagnan, or click the banner on today's show notes page, culinarylibertarian.com/50. Now let's get back to the show.
In our context today, if you're eating a good diet, you're probably not too deficient in minerals. Although I've heard people make the argument that industrial large-scale farming has depleted the soil of magnesium in particular. And a lot of people advocate that you should basically everybody should be taking supplemental magnesium. But other than that, salt, yeah, but it may be that the reason why salt is so important in the past, it was considered so important historically, is because not only the sodium chloride that people were getting, but that they were getting other things that were very rare, because shipment of foods from different places that might have the minerals that their soil's missing was, technologically or costs or labor prohibitive.
Right. You mentioned a couple of times, I want to make sure I understand what it means. What is a high energy food?
I just ate some and it went down the wrong pipe.
I hate it when that happens.
Well, when I was saying high energy, I meant all of the macronutrients.
Okay. So a container of Pringles doesn't qualify as high energy food because it isn't really food.
Well, it has the it has starches, and it has, on the outside, it's coated with whatever oil is fried in, probably some crappy seed oil and things like that. A very small amount of protein from. Are Pringles made from potatoes? I forgot.
I think at one point in existence, it was a potato. I think what happens to it along the road, it would be tough to actually identify it as a potato. I think I actually don't know. I don't really think I want to know.
There's a lot of energy in Pringles, but it does bring up another point, which is the oil that those things are cooked in. One thing that's really bad for metabolism. So when I mentioned mitochondria, everybody's favorite organelle from biology, the mitochondria has a membrane, 2 layers of membrane that are similar to the membrane around our cells or around bacterial cells. And, it kind of selectively lets things in and out. And these membranes are made with phospholipids, which are kind of like fancy fatty acids. They have something else attached to them, but they're mainly fats. They're like a fat that's been broken down, and the little pieces are used to make this membrane. And things get sequestered that way in the cells a lot, because the cell is generally a water-like environment, a hydrophilic, water-loving environment. So if you have a bunch of things that are fats, how oil and water don't mix, like in salad dressing, they will sequester themselves off. So mitochondria are made this way, and you've got this little zone, this membrane, and the fatty acids that it uses to make its membrane are coming either from your own fat production in your body or mostly dietarily. And there's a big difference in the membrane function of saturated fats and monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats. And one of the actually mainstream areas of research right now is in mitochondrial dysfunction from too many polyunsaturated fats, which are the kinds in the industrial, like the seed oils, or this, soybean, fat flour, all that stuff, like corn oil or whatever, the stuff, the cheapest oil stuff. Yeah, that would be like in a salad dressing, or, cookies that are cooked in some kind of oil, just the cheapest stuff. And they behave differently because when they're unsaturated, and I think we talked about this last time, but they basically so a fatty acid is a string. It's like a string of pearls, and the pearls are carbon atoms, and attached to the carbon atoms are hydrogen atoms. So it's like a string of carbon atoms linked together, and then each carbon atom also has 2 hydrogens to the side. So it's like a string of big pearls, and each big pearl has a couple little pearls. Now that's a saturated fatty acid. Now in the unsaturated ones, one of those lengths in the chain of that string of pearls will have 2 connection points. So it'll have 2 strings between 2 of the pearls. And that causes there to be 1 less hydrogen, one less of the little pearls that are connected to the side of those. And because of that arrangement, it makes a kink in the molecule. Now, you might have noticed, everybody's noticed this, but highly saturated fats get solid at a much lower temperature than liquid fats. So butter is very solid in the refrigerator. Room temperature, it's reasonably solid. And, if you have it outside in like 85 degrees or something, it'll start to melt.
It's a pool.
But olive oil will be liquid at room temperature. And if you keep it in the fridge, it'll stay mostly liquid. It'll get kind of milky. Have you ever seen that?
Yes.
And then, of course, if you put it in the freezer, it'll freeze. Now, something like a soybean oil, if you have it in the refrigerator, it doesn't get milky at all. And I don't know exactly what happens in the freezer, whether it stays solid or it gets milky or it freezes at the freezing temperature of water. But the point is, all these different types of fats, right? Whether it's coconut oil, all the different seed oils, the dairy fats, butter and stuff like that, they have different melting points. And the two factors that influence those melting points are the chain length and, most importantly, the unsaturation. So how many double bonds they have. And the reason that is if you imagine these chains and they get packed together. So when you have a bunch of fat, it's a bunch of these fatty acids and they pack together, and they don't like water. So they exclude water. And that tight packing is what we experience as solidity. And as you warm them up, they will release that tight packing and melt and flow. And that's what we experience as liquid. Same with water. Now, the packing that they do when there's a double bond or multiple double bonds in these fatty acid chains, it creates kinks where when there's a double bond instead of a single bond between some of these carbons, it makes like a not quite a 90-degree turn, but a turn that's much more than in the other ones. They're not as straight. And because of all these kinks, they can't pack together as tightly. So if you can imagine like a nice, neat row of like pencils or something, and they can all be smashed right up against each other. Now just imagine that same, drawer full of pencils, but you've got, those like silly flexible pens. Your kids ever have those?
Yeah.
So imagine those like writing utensils that have a bunch of kinks, and not just in 2 dimensions, but in 3 dimensions. So you couldn't orderly pack together the same amount in the same amount of space. And because of that, they will release their tight packing with less energy, a lower temperature, and they will flow more easily. Now, if you're just talking about using a fat, cooking with it, whatever, that's just a practical issue you have to understand. You have to know the melting temperature of butter. You have to know what these things are going to do. But once they get into your body and into your cells, that difference, that's a very powerful chemical difference that you can see with the naked eye. Just taking one fat out of the fridge melts, the other one stays solid. That completely changes the behavior of the membranes of something like mitochondria in our cells. And throughout pretty much all of our evolutionary history, so our body makes saturated fat. So if you eat a very low-fat diet, so you're consuming mostly carbohydrates and protein, your body will make fat because it'll need some fats. And the fats that it makes are overwhelmingly saturated. And it makes a little bit of monounsaturated fat, which is the kind that's predominantly in olive oil. So if you can imagine the human body in its normal state, if it has to make its own fats, it makes, basically what like cow fat, like a butter, a little bit of olive oil, mostly solid at room temperature, which is convenient since we're warm-blooded. We wouldn't want liquid, fats flowing around in our bodies. So when you get these, and as well, the human diet, these seed oils, the really highly unsaturated ones like soybean, those are very new. Like 100 years ago, they were very not much in the diet. And now they're the predominant fats people are eating. If people are eating processed foods, they're the ones that are used in processed foods. Like I said, salad dressings, cookies and crackers you get at the store, things like that. Mayonnaise, unless you make it at home. So, uh, so when those fats get incorporated into the mitochondria, it changes the entire shape. If you can imagine a bunch of these kinked molecules where normally they're supposed to be mostly straight, just rod straight molecules lining up, and occasionally a kinked one here or there. Well, now most of them are kinked, or a large percentage of them are kinked. That will change the function. And the other thing that will happen is they can oxidize. And once you start oxidizing the fatty acids in these membranes, these energy producing membranes, then you cause a whole bunch of other problems. That's a really active area of research for heart disease, actually, is the mitochondria and heart cells getting deranged and not being able to produce enough energy to perform the rather important functions of the heart, because their mitochondria are getting messed up. And it seems to be that they get messed up when they get these really long, very unsaturated fatty acids highly represented in the mitochondrial membrane. If you can imagine, the difference in shape that you'll get from a really long thing that has a bunch of kinks in it. Every time there's a kink, it creates a new dimension of shape distortion, I guess you could say.
Right.
It's
like my garden hose.
So that's one of that was one of the areas that I was really interested in researching when I was doing graduate school, because for whatever reason, it's just not a sexy topic how much the types of fatty acids people have consumed in the diet have changed in the past century. There's a lot of focus right now, like we talked about before, on sugar, but there's been a real sea change in the type of fats that people eat. And that seems to be having a real effect on, real basic aspects of metabolism, like the ability for the mitochondria to work at optimal capacity.
That's a level of information I didn't know. And I'm going to tell you something that you and I are both probably easily convinced of the misinformation on the interwebs. Mm-hmm. But when I was looking at some stuff, reading like a top 10 things to know about metabolism, one of the, and I'm not sure what it was, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was WebMD, and I'll trash them. They made a very careful point of saying that saturated fats are unhealthy. Now, you and I have talked enough that I don't believe that statement is an accurate statement. I've talked to some very well-informed, very well-read keto folks who also would say that statement doesn't really bear any truth. So here's the conspiracy question. For the person who's listening to this and saying, wow, I'm interested, I want to learn more about this, I'm going to go to my handy-dandy interwebs, and most of what they're going to find, there's probably a really good chance the information that person is going to read will be almost exactly opposite of what you've just talked about. So now, here's the real problem. How does anybody know what is the misinformation and what isn't the misinformation? And what do we do about that? Well, that second part is impossible to answer, but I'm not even sure the first part is easy to answer, because if you're presented with this page of information, well, the internet doesn't lie. Well, as it turns out, it actually does. This is just me venting about the frustrations of interwebs searches and companies with a particular bias toward whatever they're, just it gets into a whole murky yet very legitimate world of on purpose misinformation. So maybe the better question is how, for the people who are interested in learning more about the kinky, that's going to come out wrong, about the kinky fatty acids and the mitochondria, and understanding why that's a problem in their diet, recommend a couple of good sources so people can get on the right page, literally, for some good information.
That's tough. I don't I don't really follow that many websites anymore. The internet wasn't bad for a while, and it's pretty good. It's better than, say, picking up a textbook and just reading, or an official source like government food guide information, or like American Heart
Yeah, don't do
Association.
that.
Some of those aren't bad. Those things are made by committee. They're kind of like the climate assessment or whatever the UN does. And there's people on there, that know a lot of things, but they'll fight over the wording of a sentence, like as the narrative has changed in the research world about saturated fat. There's a lot of people that do research or do like meta research and write about science that have known for a long time that definitely the more hyperbolic statements, like saturated fat causes heart disease or something like that, people have known for a long time, well over a decade, that at the very least that's exaggerated, if not completely untrue, and maybe even completely the opposite. But there's this institutional disconnect where you have to say things that have a certain level of I guess support, and it takes a really long time. It's like trying to turn around a ship, like an enormous big ship. And the internet is at least it was, we're living through this period where things are really like the Googles and Facebooks and Twitters of the world are tightening the screws. So for the longest time, the internet was almost infinitely agile. So, as soon as something would come out, whether it's a piece of science or a new idea, people are free to write about it and they're free to share it. So these different ideas about, maybe, butter, the cholesterol and the saturated fat in butter isn't causing heart disease. Maybe it's something else. That spread on the internet like wildfire. And to the extent that those statements can be defended, it's a sustainable sharing of information that people can learn. Actually, this is kind of timely. Just a few days ago, I saw a list. Did you see it going around on social media of websites that were from Google searches that were privileged and deprivileged?
Yeah, it was astonishing. Like, it was crazy, and I forgot what the top one was. Oh, yeah, there was some health ones, and so if you typed in that website,
Right.
it would take you to the website. But how would you know that website exists? So if you're looking for top 10 foods for heart health, it's going to I think it was like 95% demoted.
Yeah, right. So a lot of the sites that were like natural kind of stuff, or in the paleosphere, basically alternative, what you could consider, call, broadly speaking, alternative health sites, were extremely deprivileged in search results, and more official sites like the Mayo Clinic, or institutions like government institutional or near government institutional websites, were privileged. And so things are getting more difficult, but I think I do still think that people that are interested, because pretty much everybody knows about some of the different dietary movements, like the low carb thing. And I think if people are motivated, they can find information. YouTube, people will talk about, how you can tell. I'll give one blanket recommendation. And it's not really a recommendation for anything specific, but if you can find a regular person, and say even like a professor, talking about something, and it seems like it's a person either writing about it or talking about it because they're interested in it and sharing information, versus something that comes across as institutionally supported, then I might take that more seriously. There's a lot of it seems like what institutions are doing, and traditional media, is they're starting to pour their resources into the internet. So something like YouTube, there's these YouTube channels now where they just are television channels that just upload their content. And that's going to continue to happen. But I think actually people are a little too smart for that. And of course, there were always people that were never going to find any of this alternative information, for good or for ill, because they're not curious enough and they're not patient enough and they, aren't smart enough or whatever to look around. So I think that there's still, a decent, I guess I don't know that many people that aren't aware of dietary information and that there's an alternative to, say, the thing that your doctor tells you. Maybe that's something, maybe if I was 20 years older, I'd have a lot of friends, that were, oh, well, my doctor, he, I've got high blood pressure and high cholesterol, so he put me on a statin and told me to not eat meat, something like that. And they'll just take that as gospel. I don't really know a lot of people like that. So it's hard for me to relate in a certain way because I grew up in the generation right before the internet. So by the time I was a young adult, it was getting going a little bit.
No, I understand what you're saying. So I think you're a little bit kind to ascribe to them an absence of malevolence. I think that the American Heart Association and the foodplate.gov and even WebMD, which I just read something about them all being sort of in cahoots with this misinformation campaign. Nina Teicholz, who is a very vocal individual person about heart health with fats and butter and cheese. Right. She's been sort of nipping at the heels of the American Heart Association for a while, and I think it was the AHA's recent board is staffed almost entirely by vegans. And when they come up with their report, they are going to in-house cross-reference it. So here, Frank, I just wrote this report. Tell me what you think. Oh, it looks great, Sue. It's so the name has some level of credential, but they're working really, really hard to provide just negligent information, and I think that's it's pure politics, and it's at everyone's detriment who pays attention to that. But people who are just going to work, paying the bills, feeding the kids, who aren't aware that there's this thing happening, who get on Saturday morning, they're going to go find out how can I have a better diet next week, and they go to one of these sites and they get all this wrong information. Well, it's from the government. It's from this trusted source. It's from the American Diabetes Association. And what sane person is really going to question that? It just doesn't. That they're doing this and doing it sneakily is really irritating to me. And so, not to go into the whole other interwebs lying to you thing, but there are a couple of web pages, search engines. Startpage.com is going to give you a result without all of the PC. One named after a kid's game. DuckDuckGoose, DuckDuckGo, something like that. People are saying that they're finding positive results, and if you've been paying attention to social media, you have seen the search window of Google and Bing and DuckDuckGo for Joe Biden. Right. And it's like, well, or the Hillary body count, body bag. So anyway, and then getting Hillary Clinton at the beach, Hillary Clinton and shoes. So I think it probably is a concern for people who don't know that they're being given possibly bad information, and getting them on the right page, pun intended, getting them on the right page to get good information is worth getting that information out there. I'm going to get back to metabolism just for a second here. From a metabolism point of view, since muscle tissue is going to, I'm going to be just colloquial, since muscle tissue metabolizes stuff at a higher rate than fat tissue, then just from that aspect alone, it makes sense for a human to engage in some kind of exercise. Now, I'm not saying you need to go be, Arnold or a, this crazy training 8 hours a day athlete, but some physical activity, maybe even getting into the anaerobic level of, I'm not sure push-ups will do that, but Herschel Walker, did never lifted a weight in his life except his own body, and Herschel was in great shape. So it seems to me, a very strong case to be made for getting off of your chair and walking up the hill a couple of miles, or, if you've got kids, wrestle with the kids on the floor. Do something to get the blood moving and increase that lean muscle tissue doing its metabolism.
Oh,
Does that
yeah,
sound
definitely. It seems like there's a kind of a set point for, because there's a lot of interesting questions like how does your body know what, what blood glucose to keep it at, or what temperature, or what the energy, how much energy do you consume in this process and that process. So we have this certain programming that all of these different rheostats going off at the same time, a thermostat for body temperature and just stats for everything. And it makes sense that, in the past, humans had a certain level of activity higher than now. So it's not difficult to guess that having next to no physical activity would not allow, the some of the balances that we might need to keep, the blood glucose going right in the right ranges, disposing of things in the blood, metabolizing these different molecules at a rate that would be healthy to keep that going. The same way as, if you lock up a calf, they do a veal calf, its body's going to be different. So if people lock themselves up into a lack of exercise and movement, you can expect that your body's going to change. Maybe not, you might not get fat right away when you're young, but something will be different. And yeah, lean tissue consumes, it almost makes, fat tissue, like I was saying, it's almost negligible in terms of the metabolic rate. So somebody that is, 500 pounds, but they would be 180 pounds if it wasn't for just all of that extra fat, their metabolic rate will not be all that much higher than a lean person who is, about 180 pounds. So it's the brain, and then the muscle tissue, and then the other lean tissues like the organs and stuff like the liver that really are metabolically active, and the fat tissue is hardly active at all. So yeah, if you just want to eat more and you don't want to get fat, you to a certain extent, you could just put on a little bit of muscle, increase your caloric requirements, and that'll at least take care of that for a little while.
Is there such a thing as having too high of metabolism?
Yeah. People can be hypermetabolic. That would be like, say if somebody was hyperthyroid and their heart rate was really high, and you could almost run a constant fever that way. It's pretty rare. Some diseases will do that. Like people, especially like certain late stage diseases will be very consumptive. Like you can imagine a patient where they kind of waste away. They get into this.
I'm sorry to tell you, I don't need to imagine that.
Right. So they can get into, now that could happen because the body switches over to a catabolic state rather than a anabolic state, and the balance is broken. But it can also happen where the person, will have a chronic, almost fever, and they'll just be kind of burning up. And yeah, that's those, that's not really too common. That would be the kind of thing that would be medically treatable. A slow metabolism seems to be more more of a problem because it's not really an acute problem, so it's not something that can be studied acutely like that. But yeah, I think cats actually, like house cats, they can tend towards hyperthyroid. Thyroid's another complicated issue. So that's one of the main regulators of your metabolism. And one of the problems with that is when your doctor, if you just get a normal blood test, like a blood panel, they will give you one test. There'll be one test for thyroid function, and it doesn't really test thyroid function. It tests something called TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. And it's the hormone that tells your body to make thyroid hormone. So it's one step removed. And it's in a negative feedback relationship with thyroid hormone. So what that means is TSH will be made in the pituitary gland, circulates in the body, and when it gets to the thyroid gland, it'll stimulate that to make thyroid hormone. And then when the body makes thyroid hormone, this circulating thyroid hormone will negatively inhibit the pituitary gland. So they're in a kind of balanced relationship. If the thyroid starts to go down, the pituitary makes more TSH. And then as the thyroid turns up its thyroid production, it'll turn down TSH. So it's in a dynamic equilibrium. But the problem is there's other reasons that TSH could be high or low than just your thyroid function itself. So somebody could say be hypothyroid, not have enough active thyroid hormone in their body, but still have a normal range TSH. And that's just one of the problems that sort of the modern medical industry, I think the TSH test is much cheaper than the test for active thyroid hormone. The full thyroid panel would be TSH and then also T3 and T4. T3 is the active thyroid hormone. T4 is a precursor that gets made by the thyroid gland, and then it gets further processed in the liver, and it lasts longer in the body. So the thyroid hormone makes a combination of active and inactive thyroid hormone, and the inactive is activated in the liver. And it's just kind of the way that it balances. So like if you're prescribed thyroid hormone, you can look on the bottle and it'll say T4, T3, and it usually has a ratio. And I guess normally they try to prescribe a ratio that's similar to what your thyroid gland itself is putting out. But that's one of those issues where a lot of people are probably hypothyroid or functionally hypothyroid. They could have a problem with liver conversion. So they might have enough T4. So if you just get your T4 tested, they'll say, oh, look, you've got plenty of that. But if it's not getting converted to T3 because there's some problem in the liver, whether that's a nutrient deficiency or something else, then you can end up being functionally hypothyroid. And it could take years to find out or never, because for whatever reason, doctors just don't like to prescribe those tests.
I can't even begin to imagine why they wouldn't do that.
Well, they have to justify it to I think it's an insurance company justification issue.
When I was doing my SALT article research, I came across some information, and I may get this part wrong because I didn't focus on it in the writing, but the thyroid and zinc. And I think it was a problem more for women than for men, but a zinc deficiency causing a thyroid, well, I'll use the word deficiency or some inefficiency. And that turns out to be a fairly big problem.
Was it zinc or was it iodine?
Probably might have been iodine. Like I said, I may have gotten the details wrong, but there was one micronutrient. Oh, and that was iodine because the iodine salt thing. But it's a big deal, and having a poorly functioning thyroid is not a good thing.
Yeah, pretty much every mineral is. Yeah, if you get down to it, every mineral and every vitamin is necessary at some level for every function of the body. It's just that some, certain functions are more linked to certain of these nutrients, so you'll get this symptom first before this one. But yeah, iodine, the relationship with iodine and thyroid hormone is that iodine ends up getting incorporated into the thyroid hormone molecule itself. So if you're deficient in iodine, you can't make thyroid hormone at all, because what it is the thyroid gland takes iodine and sticks it onto the proteins, onto the protein in specific locations that become thyroid hormone. So T4 is called T4 because it has 4 iodines, and T3 has 3. So each molecule of thyroid hormone essentially consumes 4 or 3 iodines. And that's the main relationship there. So yeah, if you're completely deficient in iodine, then you can't make thyroid hormone at all.
That sounds bad.
Yeah. And if you imagine, years and years and years ago, if somebody was landlocked, because that's the nice thing about, there's so many reasons. I'm sure historically there's all kinds of anthropological arguments about why bodies of water, towns and human civilizations, a lot of them were developed around bodies of water, whether it was an ocean coast or around a lake. But the nice thing about water, and in particular the ocean, is the minerals are more evenly distributed than on land. So I was talking before about how, certain farmland may be deficient in this or that mineral. The ocean is like everything's dissolved, right? So like if you have a glass of water and you drop a drop of iodine or zinc in there and swirl it around, in a few seconds, all the water has zinc in it, right? And iodine, because that's how diffusion works. Now, if you imagine like a handful of soil and you put a drop of zinc or iodine on the soil and you shake it up, there's still going to be plenty of that soil that doesn't have that mineral. So, before people had food shipping and the ability to buy supplements or anything like that, if you lived in a place that didn't have, for whatever reason, didn't have something in the soil, you could have a real serious problem very quickly.
It's all fascinating stuff. One last quick question about metabolism. I'm going to go into a little bit different tangent. If someone has low metabolism, so regardless, and maybe I'm assuming too much. Let's see if we can exclude body size. Just someone has low metabolism. Is some level of physical activity the first easiest thing to do to raise the metabolism? And then I guess really the question is, I think I can answer it. Why would we want to do that? So my answer is the reason we want to raise the metabolism is we want to increase the amount of energy extracted from the cells, which then makes the whole bodily function process more efficient.
Yeah. There's lean people, somebody that is maybe hypometabolic would be somebody that's cold all the time. That's one sign of it, somebody that gets cold very easily, or their circulation isn't that good and their hands and feet get cold very, very easily. Or somebody that has low blood pressure as opposed to high blood pressure, or very low heart rate. People that if they get up quickly, they get lightheaded. Those can all be signs of like a low metabolism, even if they aren't overweight, they're not gaining weight. Because on a certain level, even the ability to store fat is a metabolic process that people can, their body can just not be doing at a sufficient level for it to matter. You definitely don't want that, because pretty much everything having to do with health is linked to the metabolic rate. When you look at, like, there's one test, not a lot of people get it because there's not a ton of actionable information you can get from it, but there's a blood test that will look at, so in addition to ATP, which I was talking about, the energy currency, there's another energy currency that is, I guess you could say, a little less universal. It doesn't really leave the mitochondria during the process of energy production as much as ATP does, but it's called NAD and then NADH. So NADH, they're the same molecule. One of them has a hydrogen on it that has 2 electrons with it. And so that's the energized form of it. And then the NAD, which has a positive charge, so people call it NAD+, that's the de-energized, oxidized form of it. And if you have a high NAD to NADH ratio, that is one of the most predictive tests of just health in general, like longevity, lack of disease. And it kind of sounds like the opposite, because the highly energized molecule is the NADH form. But it ends up that what it indicates, if you have excess NADH as opposed to the NAD, that indicates that your body isn't using as much energy as I guess as you could be. So as that builds up and that ratio changes, it's very, very predictive of disease states in people. So even just outside of anything like weight, these kind of more superficial things, the metabolic rate is, another example is when people are in a disease state, their metabolic rate tends to be lower. When people are older, as opposed to when they're younger, their metabolic rate tends to be lower. So even if you're not having superficial changes like weight, the metabolic rate is just something that's associated with vitality in general. And you don't want, it's also the ability to respond to things. So if you have something like an infection or some kind of stress on the body, a higher metabolic rate will marshal the resources of the body faster than a lower metabolic rate.
Since this is the Culinary Libertarian Show, I'm going to ask you some questions that we didn't get to last time, because you had so much good information I couldn't make you stop. I didn't dare. Of the 5 flavors, sweet, salty, bitter, sour, and umami, which one do you enjoy the most?
It's definitely between salty and umami. And I'm not, I've always been a salty snacks over a sweet snacks person. Mm-hmm. And my favorite foods they tend to be definitely savory foods. It's hard to say. I do like East Asian foods, and they mostly, they tend to use the most umami. Right. So I might have to split the difference between those two.
Okay. And since you have foreshadowed my next question, what is your favorite food?
Oh, okay. This is going to be a weird one. But I have had...
From the guy who ate raw fat, really?
I have had a relationship that I actually avoid them because... So it's a snack food. It's a potato chip. And it's a potato chip that's made, just a regular company. Do you know the Hers potato chips?
I don't think I do. Sounds like I should.
They're regional, and I believe they're from Pennsylvania. So if you live in Pennsylvania or New Jersey, they have them in Florida now, but they probably don't have them on the West Coast. But it's a regional potato chip. They have a bunch of farms that supply them with potatoes, and they have a flavor of spicy chips called Red Hot Chips. And I don't know what it is. I've been trying to find a clone recipe so I could make my own. But it's some kind of spice powder that they put on the chips. It's got sugar and salt, onion powder, garlic powder, some type of chili or paprika. And it's just the perfect amount of spiciness. And of course, the problem is they fry them in these crappy oils. So I try to avoid them and not eat them that much. But to be perfectly honest, I think that they're one of my favorite flavors.
Well, the struggle is going to be figuring out which of the very many peppers they're using for that spice.
Yeah, and also the ratios, because they're fairly sweet for a savory, salty snack. It's definitely predominantly the salty, savory flavor that you get, but there's a significant sugar contribution, and yeah, it's like it turns into a red powder that you can see on the chips, and they're not. Every bag isn't the same. I guess just the way that they produce them and shake them up after frying with the spice, they're coated differently. So sometimes you open up a bag and it just has a little bit of the spice powder on it and it tastes good. But sometimes you'll crack open a bag and they'll just be coated in this powder that I love so much. and it's really a thing of beauty.
That sounds like marketing genius. You're saying you see it as a fluke of production. I'm saying this is on purpose, but who knows? But that's it. It makes me want to find somebody to send me one. It's very interesting.
Yeah, you should try them.
What is your least favorite food?
As in the thing that I've disliked the most that I've ever had, something like that, or
the thing you flat out refuse to eat?
Well, there's I eat a lot of things. I don't actually particularly like beets or sauerkraut, but okay, I've had the worst thing that I ever had that I will never eat again. Most people will never have the occasion to even try in the first place, but when I was in my raw meat eating phase, I had two particularly bad experiences, and one was much worse than the other. I tried so eating raw meat, especially if you slice it nicely and put like spices on it, you make like a tartare, it can be very pleasant. But when you get into things like organ meats, it can be extremely unpleasant. And I've had kidneys cooked.
I knew it. I was ahead of you. I knew it.
Yeah, kidneys are. I think they're difficult to prepare. I had a kidney dish in Nicaragua once that was prepared with a cream sauce, and whatever they did to it, it took a lot of the acridness out of the kidney. And I've also had them in traditional Chinese restaurants. They usually cook them with like a chili oil, and they use like the Sichuan chilies and star anise and a bunch of other flavors. And those were very good. But yeah, one time I took a bite into raw beef kidney, and it was like concentrated urine inside of very badly textured meat. Like, how organs like liver, especially when they're raw, they have a softer texture.
Yeah,
they just kind of pop in your mouth, and it's very so that was absolutely disgusting. And a close runner up was when I ate, now I like tongue, like at Mexican places, like in tacos they use tongue a lot, but I didn't know when I started cooking it on my own, I learned that you cook the tongue, a lot of people will boil it or something, and then you peel the white layer off.
Yeah.
So I had a package of raw tongue, and I took a bite, and I included the white, gland layer. And the glands, the salivary glands of this long since dead cow started producing saliva in my mouth. So the flavor was...
for those of you who are driving, please keep paying attention to the road.
Yeah, the flavor wasn't quite as bad as raw kidney, but the experience of, swapping spit with a dead animal was a close runner-up.
I think your explanation is far more impressive than anything anybody's mind just created. That's a story. I think you might win the prize for the best least favorite food story. That's nice. Amazing. What gets you excited?
New ideas, and probably, and anybody that knows me is going to know this, arguing.
No, really?
Or maybe politely putting it debate.
Oh, either one's fine. What turns you off?
I guess when people are not interested in new ideas, or a social situation where debate is looked down upon. Like if you're in a situation and you have an idea or you have something to say, and you get that feeling in the air, like people aren't going to be interested, or they're going to look at you like you're a bad person, or we're just trying to get out of here. Why do you want to bring something up? We're finishing business or whatever it is. That kind of a situation is a big turnoff for me.
Like Thanksgiving dinner time and everybody just sat down.
Yeah, certain.
So what about that President Trump?
Right.
Thanks, Kyle.
Some people carry around, and you can feel it, well, some people can't feel it. And that's why a lot of people get accused of autism. But, a lot of people carry around these sort of metaphorical bottles of nitroglycerin, that you can feel that they have in their hand about certain topics. And there's just this unspoken thing between you where they look at you, or there's just an ambiance in the air where if you bring up a certain topic, or even just talking about something, like if it's diet or something that you're passionate about, they'll just kind of threaten in a social way, implicitly, not explicitly, to dash that bottle to the ground in an explosion.
How dare you threaten my 3x5 card illusions? No, yeah, I think everybody knows that situation, regardless of diet preferences, gender preferences, political affiliations. Everybody knows that experience. What sound do you love?
Sound. Probably any sound that water makes, like falling water.
Oh, that's a good sound. What sound do you hate?
I hate. Oh, you know what I really hate? The default alarm sound for iPhones that people, like, I guess older people don't know how to change it. And I think that used to be my alarm sound. And the sound that you wake up to kind of gets associated with like unpleasantness, you get woken up by it. And where I work, for some reason, people, they have these labs and they might be doing an experiment, and a large amount of people will set their phones to alarm when they have to go get their experiment because it's finished, and they use that tone. I probably can't do it right, but it's like do 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 do.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
yeah, I hate that.
It's pretty bad. And what is your favorite food indulgence?
Okay, well, I can't do the chips again because I just did that. So, I think I don't go out to eat all that much. And I try to save it up. And in particular, I was talking about traditional Chinese when I mentioned the kidneys. Have you ever been to, I don't know what you call that cuisine, but a traditional Chinese place, they'll have things like, organs, or they'll have tripe. There's an appetizer I've seen in a lot of places that's jellyfish. It's a cold dish, cold sliced jellyfish. Have you ever been to a place like that?
I have not.
Yeah, I don't know how widespread they are. I discovered them not that long ago. A lot of times the menu will be in Chinese, or they'll give you like an English menu, and you'll look and you'll see there's like half the things that are on the Chinese menu for the people next to you, because they're really catering to real Chinese people. It's not like General Tso's chicken or whatever. But yeah, right. Those authentic Chinese places, I love the flavors, but it's a guilty indulgence because I know that they cook with a ton of these vegetable oils. So I like to stay away from it. But I have to admit that whatever they're doing with these vegetable oils and with the different ingredients, they make tripe and kidney and like chicken liver and the jellyfish dish and all kinds of things. I love the flavors.
It's interesting that I just realized I don't think of tripe and kidneys and Chinese food at the same time. When I'm thinking about tripe or any of the offal meats, I'm thinking of provincial French. Now, that's almost entirely due to my culinary background being in classical French, so that makes some sense. But it makes perfect sense that the Chinese would, in fact, eat all of those things. It also makes sense that most Americans would never see them on the menu.
Right. Yeah. I think the first wave of, I don't really know anything about Chinese immigration to America, but it makes sense that the Chinese people that wanted to make money selling a facsimile of their food to Americans basically, Americanized their menu and created what we know of as American Chinese food. And, that some of those dishes have their merits, but the extremity of the flavors, like the sauces that are used in the more authentic places, they're much more pungent. They're much stronger. The smells are stronger. So I could see how some people get turned off. They're spicier, so that's been toned down. And of course, yeah, the organs and, the tripe and other intestinal, stomach and that kind of stuff, that they take that off the menu. But I love that stuff. I don't know what it is, but I've for years and years, ever since maybe adolescence, I've been pretty food adventurous. I remember when I was a kid, I had some food phobias, or I was slightly a picky eater, but I grew out of it around age 10 or 11, and since then I've been pretty
Wow.
interested in what's out there.
That's a pretty early stage to not have a food phobia.
Actually, I think I was afraid of tomatoes until I was like 18. And I've heard.
Well, I don't have that problem. I've got kids. They will. My little one used to eat them green off the vine. Well, she didn't care. She didn't get sick, but I was really mad because I wanted them to turn red. Those are my cherry tomatoes. Stop eating them.
I've heard actually that tomatoes are trigger foods for people. There's people that that are picky eaters in a diagnosable way. Like they get diagnosed with whatever it's called, but it's like a real problem where like they have it's hard for them to, I think I heard some like story about it on, some podcast or something, but some people have, and tomatoes apparently are a very common food that these people are, something about the texture. But yeah, I remember I had a problem with tomatoes for a while, and then I noticed that I was eating slices of tomatoes on things like burgers. And over time, my brain just decided it was okay.
Well, that's good, because tomatoes are great things.
They are.
For anybody who is interested in learning more about metabolism and diet and these things, are there any lay books that you can recommend for somebody who wants to learn some more?
Yeah, I can. So my thinking about human health, I'm in actually the kind of people that I follow and that I agree with their stances. A lot of them call their perspective like a metabolic perspective, as opposed to say somebody who's like paleo or low carb. And so that would basically loosely means that one of their first principles would be having a high healthy metabolic rate is good. So whatever kind of foods or lifestyle contribute to that would be something they would recommend. And there's a particular scientist, his name's Ray Peat, that he's an older guy, but he's been writing articles on websites and has this newsletter for decades. And he talks about this stuff. And there's a woman who wrote a book that sort of synthesizes a lot of those ideas into practical things that you can do. And I believe her name is Kate Deering, Deering. And her book is something like How to Heal Your Metabolism. It's something, let me see here. Yes, How to Heal Your Metabolism. And, she's one of those people that she did a lot of, I think she was a nutritionist and a personal trainer, and she had some health problems after she had, because a lot of those people will kind of develop like do you know what orthorexia is?
I do not.
Orthorexia is when you have a restrictive diet or way of eating, you control your diet to the point where it's unhealthy, like how anorexia is not eating.
Oh, okay.
So orthorexia would be like, you don't eat anything but whatever it is, pick it. And to the point where it's obvious that it's hurting your health, but you're so either phobic of the other foods or you just believe that your diet is healthy so much that you can't let go of that. So a lot of people that get into extreme health and fitness will develop these tendencies. And I think that she went through that and then discovered the perspective of, eating foods, not restricting foods to lose weight and to keep your weight down, but eating foods that help stimulate your metabolism to keep yourself at a healthy weight. And then she turned that into a book.
Cool. Well, that sounds like a good thing to start with. And I'm going to put the show notes page. I'm going to put links to those things on today's show notes page, which will be culinarylibertarian.com/50. And well, Kyle, this was fascinating. This is even more fascinating than I expected. And if I were 30 years younger, I would consider going and learning about this for a career. But I'm old and feeble, and so I'm going to have to rely on you to fill me in on the gaps. But thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure.
And have a great afternoon there in balmy Florida. and we'll talk again soon.
Alrighty.
Thanks. All right, folks, that's going to do it. Links to the resources mentioned will be at culinarilibertarian.com/50. Kyle mentioned Repeat, that's P-E-A-T, and there are some of his books on Amazon. They are very expensive. I'll put a link to a page with his books, as well as the book by Kate Deering, author of How to Heal Your Metabolism, which is the other author Kyle mentioned. As fall grows near, red wines become popular again. My affiliate, IWA Wines, focuses exclusively on products and accessories that enhance our wine experience. IWA is based in the heart of California's wine country, and they design custom wine cellars, manufacture Cellar Pro cooling units, and stock a wide selection of wine accessories, stemware, home decor, and gifts. From the simple and practical to the elaborate and luxurious. Click over with my affiliate link, culinarilibertarian.com/IWA wine, to see the selection of bottle openers and stemware, wine coolers, or impressive wine cellars. Find the perfect gifts for the wine enthusiast in your life or for yourself. culinarilibertarian.com/IWA wine. Have a good week, and I'll see you soon. Music for the Culinary Libertarian podcast is provided by Matthew Bankert at mattbankert.com.